Look, it's like this. If I ever find a lamp and I start rubbing it and then a genie comes out of it, but it's not a normal genie, it's an oddly specific genie who only grants wishes that are customized to your interests, and he says to me, like, you can't just wish for whatever you want. I detect that you are a man who loves the past and the histories, and therefore I shall grant you only the following. You shall get 5 meals, and these 5 meals can be with any historical characters you want. Choose wisely. Then I would be like, well, obviously I want Jesus. And he'd be like, no, except not Jesus of Nazareth. That one, he's out because that causes theology problems. And I just don't want to take a whole episode to try to explain this hypothetical and how I think that would, like, the genie can't summon Jesus. So that one's just out. It's going to have to be somebody who wasn't God in the flesh. So now I got to come up with my list, right? And if that ever happened, I think close to number 1 or maybe number 1 on my list would be Xerxes, king of Persia, king of lands, king of kings, ruler of nations. I would like to pick that guy's brain. And where would we go to eat? You know what? He would probably be really used to fancy stuff. I don't think I'd take him to Dakota Steakhouse. It is crazy nice, but their steaks over there are getting spendy. Maybe it's still worth it, but I don't know, $50 for a steak. I just can't justify that. I think I'd take him to Chili's because they're doing this thing now where they got these dips. They got like these 3 cheese dips, and you choose like a queso dip or like a queso blanco. You can mix and match them as much as you want. I think I'd get him that, and then I'd get him some of those honey chipotle chicken crispers because they're sweet, but they've got kick. I think that's what we do. Me and Xerxes at Chili's. That's my wish. Poof. And then there I am at Chili's with Xerxes, king of kings. And of course, I got to take the first probably quarter of the meal just to explain exactly what's going on and how this works. But then once we're into it and we're going to know each other, it turns out he's actually a really cool guy. But the thing I'd want to be looking for is whether the stuff that all the historians say about him, which is pretty critical and not terribly flattering, whether that stuff is true or whether there's something secret inside of that guy that got lost to history that only I would be the knower of because I got that wish from that oddly specific genie and used it on Chili's with Xerxes. The reputation that Xerxes has is one of decadence and manipulatability. And enough sources seem to agree that those were his weaknesses that you got to take that seriously to some extent. But you also have to acknowledge that almost all the sources that we have that tell us things about Xerxes, this great, great, influential king, they're all coming from a perspective of relative weakness before his power, and they all in one way or another seem to benefit, or almost all of them seem to benefit from characterizing him as having some certain things that are wrong with him, certain flaws. And so, of course, in the biblical account of Esther, his fatal flaw is that he is incredibly manipulatable, and God uses that manipulatability for the benefit of his people. And when you go over to Herodotus, the Greek historian, we see this lavish decadence thing layered on top of that being one of his weaknesses. But again, even from the early going, we see his insecurities and his manipulatability being his weakness there also. Now, it's not a contemporary source. It's a little bit more recent than that. But Zack Snyder, the guy who made that 300 movie, he clearly viewed Xerxes as being decadent and manipulatable as well. Well, here's the thing. We've talked about it on here before, back when we were going through the book of Matthew. There's this old Syracusan myth. You got this king, this character Damocles. And Damocles has this sword that hangs over him that is demonstrative of what it is to rule, and the sword hangs by a single horse's hair. And the lesson of this story that we don't have time to totally unpack right now is that what you do to become king, the processes by which one becomes king, makes it very difficult for one to rule well or rule justly. And I certainly think that smacks of truth in terms of the highest office in our country. Really good, emotionally mature, healthy people who are well-grounded and have deep moral roots and are not sold out to something bigger are never going to run for that office, or if they do, they're never going to get meaningful traction. And I think most Americans of all political stripes feel that way, that you have to sacrifice something that will inhibit your ability to rule well in order to gain that office. So it's not just an ancient perspective. This sort of Damocles principle is one that I think echoes throughout all of time. Well, what were the circumstances by which Xerxes became king that might make him someone who's insecure and susceptible to manipulation? Well, number one, he inherited a whole bunch of insecurities from his dad because of how his dad came to power, something we've talked about a lot here. Darius went to great lengths to shut down anybody who would question the official narrative about how he came to power. He carved things into rocks. He went to war to stop people from spreading lies. He had to be viewed as the establisher and solidifier of the great Achaemenid dynasty in order for his narrative about himself to work. And so occasionally he would do kooky things to defend that little corner of intellectual real estate, that little corner of identity real estate for himself. Well, as we talked about yesterday, Darius gets old. He needs to go put down a rebellion in Egypt. We learn about this in Book 7 of the Histories from Herodotus, but there isn't clarity yet as to who is going to be his successor because he married a commoner before he became king, and he had kids with her, and that's his oldest kid. But then after he became king, he married the daughter of Cyrus the Great, Atassa, and her oldest, Xerxes, is certainly very formidable. It seems like maybe he should be king. And Darius, we discover at the beginning of Book 7, is kind of acting like Michael Scott the day that he had to just sign that thing on a sheet of paper in the American version of The Office. And it's the simplest thing ever, but for whatever reason, it just became a thing and he just didn't want to do it and he just wanted people to like him. We're getting that kind of neurosis from Darius, who just keeps delaying naming a successor until one day along comes this exiled former king of the Spartans. Now, that's interesting because that's a rival of the Persians, obviously. And this guy, Demaratus, comes to the king's court in Susa toward the very end of the life of Darius and is like, hey, man, we got to settle this whole succession crisis that you're dealing with, and I might actually have something from native Spartan tradition that could help you. And he says that back in Sparta, the way it works is that, quote, if some of the sons had been born first before their father began to reign in Sparta, and another came after, born later while he was reigning, the succession of the kingdom of Sparta belonged to him who had been born later. This seems to have given Darius the language he needed to make his decision. And so it's really interesting that one of the most fateful decisions in the history of the Persian Empire comes down to a subtle manipulation that'll play itself out a little bit later on with this Demaratus character as Herodotus' story unfolds. Well, Darius is like, all right, that works. I can latch onto that. And so Xerxes is the one he chooses. Well, Xerxes is going to know that's how he got picked. So now he not only gets all of his dad's manipulatability and insecurity because of the questions of how dad came to power, but he's also going to get right off the bat an insecurity of his own. He's not the oldest son, and he did not grow up and receive his princely training knowing that he would be the great king. He probably grew up imagining that he would be some sort of satrap or governor, probably over a significant province, but not the great king of kings. And Herodotus tells the story in such a way that Xerxes is fully aware that Demaratus of Sparta is the guy providing this language, whispering it into the ear of his father. So it's some narrative from some foreigner, some manipulation that gains him power. I think that's probably going to stick with Xerxes. But then right after that, the very next thing that Herodotus tells us about Xerxes' early reign starting in the fall of 486 BC after the death of his father is that Xerxes has got some ideas about some things that he'd kind of like to try out as king and some campaigns that he'd like to go on. But then Mardonius, a family member and a cousin of Xerxes, comes along and starts to whisper in his ear again and manipulates him into reducing the priorities that Xerxes had in mind and elevating the priority to go and punish those Athenians, to go and punish those Greeks for what they did to Darius at Marathon and what they did in burning Sardis and aiding those rebellious Greeks on Asia Minor before that. And so Xerxes' entire foreign policy plan gets dictated to him by a couple of conversations and manipulations in the early going. And indeed, if we go and look at the book of Esther, we see that this king is highly susceptible to manipulation and highly susceptible to making decisions based on public embarrassment. So we're going to see a banquet really early on in the reign of Xerxes here, where he tells his wife to do a sexy dance to entertain all of his buddies who are probably preparing for this exact invasion of Greece that we're looking at here. And when his wife won't do it, well, Xerxes is a real boy. You don't embarrass Xerxes, the real boy, in front of his friends. And he issues some crazy, sweeping, global decree about how wives and husbands are supposed to be. And he has the beauty pageant contest that has some other seedier elements to it as well, surely, to determine who the next queen is going to be. And stuff just goes nuclear in the royal court because he gets embarrassed and he gets some suggestions from people he wants to make happy. So look, on the one hand, we see this kind of stuff. A king very susceptible to these kind of machinations, very susceptible to acting upon his insecurities in ways that maybe aren't always the best. But on the other hand, you got to look at the growth and expansion and power of Persia while he was in charge and acknowledge, I don't think a total clown could have pulled that off. This guy must have been very talented, very well trained. And so we're going to consider the other side of the coin when it comes to Xerxes and who this guy was next time around. We have a running conversation over at reddit.com. The specific subreddit is r/TMBH podcast. There's a lot of people over there who say a lot of smart things, and I check in on that, and I rather enjoy it. If you might be interested in something like that, I don't necessarily recommend all of reddit.com, but it is a nice place to have conversations. And I'm going to have my friend Jeffrey create a conversation thread over there for who your 5 meals with historical characters would be with if you met an oddly specific genie. And I'd also love to hear your guesses as to who my other 4 would be. Final thing, yesterday before I recorded the episode, my friend Jeff was like, hey, give me something to work with the Tom Petty today. I just want to goof around with some Tom Petty music. I'll see what I can do. So I jotted down 20 or 25 titles of Tom Petty songs and just without too much effort or energy, worked the full titles of those songs all throughout the episode. They're just sprinkled in there for you as Easter eggs. And I would also love to hear over on the subreddit which one of those you might have caught. Or if you're not into things like that and you're like, just tell me about history in the Bible, quit messing around with dumb things. I can also respect that. I'm so very, 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 very sorry. Thank you for being here. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.